Welcome to the ArmaniTalks YouTube channel. I'm your host, ArmaniTalks. In this channel, I'm covering communication skills for you to level up your way with words and become much more articulate. In today's episode, we're diving into the world of creativity, and we're going to be talking about this very innovative concept known as idea sex. I believe this phrase was created by Matt Ridley, who's a prominent scientist, but I'm not too sure. The concept of idea sex pretty much means that when you have different ideas out there, eventually, in a very organic way, they begin to connect in order to form something unique. And one of the first times that I witnessed an idea sex moment was a flashback. I was watching this one interview of Steve Jobs in one of these tech conferences, and within these conferences that he would attend, every now and then he would showcase one of the new things that Apple was working on. And in this particular conference, he starts to showcase what Apple iTunes is going to do. And by the way, this was around 2005 to 2007. So this was very revolutionary technology. If you're a 90s baby, you know exactly what it was like to use these old school, disgusting MP3 players. Technically, MP3 players were more high-tech than CD players, but the CD players were easy to use, where these MP3 players, you had to click all these different buttons in order to hopefully get your song. The iPod changed that completely. So within this conference, Steve Jobs is over here talking about iTunes and its connection with iPod, but that's when he says something unique. He says, and he gets the guy that's interviewing him, and he's like, "Hey, you created this little radio show that you want to play, right?" And apparently, Steve Jobs and this guy were working together in order to awe the audience, and the host is like, "Yep." And that's when, within iTunes, Steve Jobs clicks play. And you hear this guy, the host, doing this radio show, which it didn't seem like much. The audience was like, well, what gives? I mean, who cares? I mean, radio's been around for so long. So has broadcast. This isn't a big deal. Come on, Steve Jobs, do better. But that's when Steve Jobs says, this show, it is not being hosted in radio. This guy literally just bought a mic, he connected the mic to a laptop, and he is creating his own show. And now he is putting it into iTunes. Still, people couldn't quite get it. I mean, even at the end of the presentation, the audience members were like, okay. But there was one line that stuck out to me. iPod, okay? iPod. And broadcast. Two different ideas. But when you connect it, you get podcast. See, nowadays, in 2023, we take it for granted what podcasting means. But it's crazy. Because before, whenever people were doing radio shows, it was being produced. I mean, you had to sign up for a radio broadcasting program. You had to get trained. You had to get a script and such. And hopefully you get your show aired to be heard by other people. But here was Steve Jobs, roughly around 2007, introducing the language of podcast, but people just weren't getting it. iPod plus broadcast into one creates podcast. That's an idea sex moment right there. So nowadays, I mean, if you go to someone, let's say that's a teenager, or let's say in 20 to 25, and you tell them, you ask them, what do you consume throughout the day? And they say, oh, they're not going to say books. Most of them are going to say podcasts, tweets, and TikToks. Podcast. This is huge. So Steve Jobs introduced an idea sex moment, and a lot of the times when idea sex moments are introduced, it's not going to be picked up by other people until, if it's successful, until a few years later. Ideas work in a very similar fashion as the Darwinian evolution. Certain ideas survive, certain ideas die off. And luckily for Steve Jobs' one, it survived. So in order to play around with idea sex moments, every now and then you can just combine different words. And other times you don't even have to do this with intention. It will just organically happen. I mean, in my book, Speakeasy, one of the chapters is called the articulation chamber. And this is when one idea was the importance of articulating yourself. And the other idea was to create a gym-like atmosphere in order to practice articulation skills. This is my articulation chamber. This is where I come in order to express ideas. So I'm basically getting the idea of gym because we go to the gym to work out, but I'm trying to remix it to just work out our articulation skills. This is an idea sex moment. So play around with this idea of idea sex, and you'll see that there are a lot of opportunities for you to not only influence your present day self, but for you to influence the future day self, sort of like Steve Jobs was doing in that conference. But unfortunately, that past audience didn't appreciate it. But nowadays, we appreciate it. If you enjoyed today's talk, go and drop that like for me right on below. And thank you very much for joining the ArmaniTalks YouTube channel.